Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on some European nightcrawler worm bins. I've got European nightcrawlers living in a few places. I've got some living down there in the yellow buckets, but those aren't the ones we're feeding. The ones we're feeding today are much newer. So the newer systems of mine are over here to the right. And these are the European nightcrawlers that we're checking in on today. There are a couple of bins that have been in service now for 36 days. And we've kind of gotten into a habit now of checking in on them every 12 days. So on day 12 they got checked in on day 24 they got checked in on, and now on day 36 they're getting checked in on. So there was food in the bin when they arrived into the systems. That was feeding 1. Day 12 was feeding 2. Day 24 was feeding number 3. So today's check-in is feeding number 4. And I've got some worm bin population estimates to share with you based on people's feedback and their comments in the previous videos. So we're going to get these systems up on the bench. I'm going to get a glove on, and we're going to get them fed. The food they're getting today is a couple slices of moldy bread sitting in some water. I've already soaked these 2 slices of bread to make sure that they don't go into the worm bin dry. And here I've got some plums and some white pumpkin. Hopefully it's a feeding that the worms will enjoy and appreciate. Before we get started, really quick, I think we've covered most of the info here on this information board, but like I promised earlier, we've got some worm bin estimate numbers to share with you. So the numbers I shared previously were from the initial launch of the system, where we had arrived at some estimates here that were pretty close. We thought that the population of bin number 1 was 2,960 worms, and slightly less in bin 2, it was 2911, and it was for that reason that when we did the haul out of the stragglers over in the harvested castings, we had set up a bait box and we collected up whatever we could as far as stragglers that were left behind. And well, now it seems like by 12 we got a slightly larger population estimate over here in bin number 2, 2972. I mean, in a way, it almost seems like we could take 6 worms from here and drop them in there, and then we would have twin bins with the same number of worms thought to be living in both, but I don't think we'll do that. These are estimates after all. They're probably not all that accurate. 8 people provided me estimates for the initial population numbers, and then another 8 people chimed in to provide their thoughts on the addition of worms with the haul out of the bait box. So 8 and 8, that includes my own estimate as well. So myself plus 7 people kicking in their thoughts on how many worms are thought to occupy these bins. We've got top covering newspaper here. Usually I deploy the top covering newspaper as a single sheet of paper, but it feels to me like this might be, this is folded over paper here, so it's 2 sheets of newspaper, which will probably make it a little bit more durable and resistant to worm worm activity, or getting nibbled down and eaten by the worms. And I can see that our feeding zone indicators are holding up really well too. These coffee filters are resting here in the middle, showing us where the trench is that we dug into which the foods got dropped. And we don't have any sort of out of the ordinary feeding approach designated for these systems. We're just feeding down the middle here, just like we do everywhere else, with the exception of just a couple little minor deviations from that routine. And before we get too far along, I'd like to bring in my mosquito dunks, which mosquito dunks, if you own property and you have puddles or a pond or a place where mosquitoes are thought to breed and multiply, then you might already know what mosquito dunks is. It's just this material that you drop into standing water so that it doesn't become a mosquito nursery. And in the past I had always taken the mosquito dunks and used it as prescribed on the packaging, making a solution out of it, dropping it into water and spraying the water into the systems. But more recently I've been trying it this way, taking the mosquito dunks and grinding it up into these little flakes and dumping it into the systems this way. I only saw one or two little flying insects kind of hanging out here. I don't think that there's a major problem, but it's just a little bit of peace of mind, I guess we're going to try to give ourselves over here. So before we excavate the feeding zones, let's just do a quick check on the outskirts of the systems to see how things look. You know, right away I can see worms hanging out within the material, telling me that it's probably comfortably damp so that the worms feel okay being out in that stuff. Sometimes I worry a little bit because when I check the outskirts I don't find worms there. My first gut instinct is that perhaps the material is just not damp enough for the worms to want to be there. But here too, as I till up the outskirts, I'm finding a nice bit of moisture and a few worms hanging out over there. So that's already a pretty good sign. Good to see. Here and there I'm bumping into little hard objects like this. To me feels like a stem of a pumpkin. It's unusual how I've kind of grown into the, I don't know, like the habit of, I don't know if it's a habit, it's a skill. Is it a skill that I've acquired to be able to like identify things just by bumping into them and touching them? As you saw, that piece of pumpkin stem just went to shreds. So that pumpkin stem would have probably been with the worms for a really, really long time. I mean, we're now in the Halloween season. I assume pretty soon people are going to be taking down their Halloween decorations and putting them out there for either the trash people to take away or other things. So sometimes I cruise around and I try to salvage pumpkins that people are just throwing away after the need for the Halloween decorations has come and gone. So the pumpkin that we're feeding today is actually not even a leftover from last season, but it's leftover from 2 seasons ago. I was shocked at how long that pumpkin was able to resist decay over all that time. But it finally started showing signs of getting soft, and that was my cue to chop the thing up and freeze it. So I am going to be serving pumpkin in a few of my worm bin feedings over the next few check-ins because I've got a good bit of it. It wasn't a very large pumpkin, but it's amazing how far that stuff goes when you start to hack a pumpkin into bits and into little cubes like I do, and then you find that you've really got quite a bit. Wow, look at that. I watched the video from the last time we checked in on these little guys, and we gave them some peach. I think each bin was provided with half of a peach, minus the pit. That's what I believe we have here. It feels like there's a pretty good bit of the fruit remaining, actually. There will be another half in there as well. Let's see if we can locate the other piece of peach. It's probably not far away, and it probably has a similar mob scene of worms hanging around it. Yeah, nice turnout over here. Here we go. I think this might be it. No, I don't think so. There was a banana peel fed last time as well. In addition to those fruits, I believe there was also some veggie matter. It was what appeared to be like that white carrot, parsnip I think it's called. So the parsnip was probably kind of popular too, but probably not nearly as popular as the peach and the banana peel. Alright, I just found a little chunk of cardboard. I figured I would delaminate it and peel it apart into 2 pieces, maybe helping with the breakdown process. I was fairly sure that there had been 2 pieces of peach in each system based on what I saw when I reviewed the video from last time, but I'm not finding it here, so that's okay. I'm not going to go on a wild goose chase. I guess there's always that possibility that maybe they've succeeded in doing away with it already. Although considering the size of the piece that we did bump into, you would have to imagine that there's another similarly sized piece in here. But yeah, like I said, we're not going to go hunting for it. I just wanted to make sure we've opened up a large enough opening into which we can drop today's foods. So I've got a little collection of things over here on the side that we'll include down in the feeding area. Let's see how they're doing over in bin number 2 down the feeding zone. Definitely a lot more worms hanging down in the feeding zone than out on the edges. And I guess with leftovers remaining from the last feeding 12 days ago, it's not too surprising since they're still working on what they got last time. Some people, I think, would probably bump into a pile of leftovers and see a banana peel and maybe some leftover peach and decide that they're not going to feed because there's still plenty for the worms to keep working on. That's not my style, really. I just go for it. They're gonna get fed today, whether or not I find leftovers. Another piece of banana peel. I don't know. Maybe there was just something with that one half of a peach over in bin number 1 that's taken them longer, or maybe it was somehow obscured or blocked from being easily accessible. And maybe that's why it survived up until now, because it does seem like the other 3 halves of peach that were fed to these 2 systems are gone, because I see nothing. All I found over here was some banana peel. So, whatever. Just these little unusual things sometimes. You sort of see something, and then you start assuming that you're going to see something based on what you just saw, and lo and behold, the worm bin has thrown you a curveball, shattering your expectations. So I'm going to grab some bedding to include with today's feeding, drop it down here into the feeding zone, and then in can come the bread. As you can see, seems like every day I check in on it, there's more and more mold developing on this bread. I'm almost done with this loaf. It was about a half a loaf of bread, and at this point there's just little chunks. I chopped up what remained into little pieces so that it'll be easy to feed next time. I wouldn't have to get the knife out. So the plum I'm assuming is going to be a really popular item, just loaded with sugary deliciousness. So let's get them set up with this yummy meal. I'm going to drop in a little bit of grit to include with the feeding, and I think before we cover up we can probably spare a little bit more bedding for these little guys to top off the foods that they just received. Yeah, these are night crawlers after all, right? They love their bedding. And besides, I wanted to bring back the leftovers and have something to rest these on, because these leftovers probably have a good bit of worms still hanging out on them, as we saw on that piece of plum. I mean, on that piece of leftover peach, right? And since the foods that I just threw in there were frozen, I felt like a little shielding layer of bedding material between the frozen foods below and the leftovers with worms on them might be a nice thing, so the worms aren't getting plopped in on top of a bunch of frozen stuff. And back can come the stuff we excavated and level things off. So yeah, the feeding's not too far down low. I mean, we did dig a little bit of a trench into which we submerged it, and the worms seem to have no problem locating the food when it's been submerged a little bit like that. I mean, the worms pretty much cruise the entire system. They're going all over the place. And when they stumble on a nice treat like what we've been giving them, it's not surprising that they stick around and gorge themselves on it. Wouldn't you, if you were a wormy? I know I would. So, these feeding zone indicators are really holding up quite nicely. Perhaps that in itself is testament to the degree to which they enjoyed their last feeding. They pretty much paid the feeding zone indicator in the top cover newspaper. They paid that stuff virtually no attention at all. Sometimes the worms come up and start chewing on that stuff, but then again, these are fairly new systems loaded with plenty of bedding material for the worms to chew on. So if they're in the mood for paper type products, there's an abundance of it throughout the system. So I think that stuff is pretty safe for now. Let's make sure this little guy is down in the bed and not trapped within this plastic baggie over here. And back can come this other plastic bag as well. That's the reason I try to open up these bags and face the opening upwards so that worms don't find themselves in the bag where there's really not a whole lot of moisture. Just seems like the safer way to go. So we're pretty much done here with these European night crawlers. Getting feeding number 4 on day 36 after a 12-day pause between feedings. And who knows? Maybe it'll be another 12 days. It's certainly not a rule, but it's definitely turning into a pattern. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.